In his manifesto of 1909 entitled Hind Swaraj or Indian Home Rule, Gandhi inveighed against parliamentary democracy as a system whose cacophony actively subverted the kind of liberty that was premised on the freedom and integrity of voice, speech, and deliberation. He sought to describe the way in which Parliament operated only with the spur of outside pressure, indifferent as to whether this took the form of popular demands or the blandishments of a wealthy few. At the same time, it was placed under the control of changing masters in the shape of the Prime Minister and his cabinet, who bought loyalty by the inducements of wealth, honors, and influence. Forced to abide by party discipline, its members were enthralled to these changing leaders who were themselves concerned solely with the expansion of their power. In such a system, whose stability relied upon the ritualization of conflict along party lines, neither truth, justice, goodness, nor indeed the public interest were served except by accident. As for the voters' freedom of conscience and judgment, whose deliberations were necessarily silent, it was drowned out by a purely partisan political debate in Parliament and the press. And I quote Gandhi, "To the English voters, their newspaper is their Bible. They take their cue from their newspapers, which are often dishonest. The same fact is differently interpreted by different newspapers according to the party in whose interests they are edited. One newspaper would consider a great Englishman to be a paragon of honesty, another would consider him dishonest. What must be the condition of the people whose newspapers are of this type?" Close quote. The competition set up by parliamentary democracy produced stability at the expense of truth and so freedom, which could only lose meaning without the former. Now, instead of seeing the alternation of governments in a democracy as demonstrating the political freedom it promised, Gandhi understood it as an example of inconstancy that was itself mechanical, and I quote, "These people change their views frequently. It is said that they change them every 7 years. These views swing like the pendulum of a clock and are never steadfast. The people would follow a powerful orator or a man who gives them parties, receptions, etc. As are the people, so is their parliament." Close quote. Rather than blaming the English for this state of affairs, Gandhi attributed it to the link between parliamentary democracy and industrial capitalism, or what he called modern civilization, whose, quote, "true test lies in the fact that people living in it make bodily welfare the object of life," close quote. But modern civilization failed to satisfy bodily wants, and not only because it was made possible for a few at the expense of the many. Also important was the fact that its desire was insatiable and led to a limitless expansion no different from that which marked the thirst for power in party politics. Indeed, the two were linked in the growth of capital, industry, and empire. Gandhi described this desire in the language of addiction and saw it resulting in the destruction of the subject whose freedom democracy was meant to seek. Quote, "It is eating into the vitals of the English nation. It must be shunned. Parliaments are really emblems of slavery. If you will sufficiently think over this, you will entertain the same opinion and cease to blame the English. They rather deserve our sympathy." Close quote. In order to protect political voice, speech, and deliberation from being drowned out by the noise of parliamentary democracy, Gandhi had recourse to the power of silence instead. Gandhi's withholding of speech in practices like his weekly days of silence have been interpreted in purely religious and nativist terms. But I want to look at his many pronouncements on silence as political statements that had contemporary debates on representation as their context. During the 19th century, for example, the real and potential expansion of the franchise in England gave rise to new anxieties about the independence of voice in political life. It was ostensibly to protect the liberty of this voice that voting rights were restricted to adult males, property owners, and the educated. These qualifications made for overlapping but not identical groups whose eligibility to vote was determined by the gravity of their voices. For it was thought that only such men possessed the requisite investment in, responsibility for, and knowledge about their society to be entrusted with its governance. The reasoning behind such exclusions in the name of guaranteeing both the freedom and therefore meaningfulness of an individual's political voice remained the same even when some alteration to these qualifications was made. Thus, men of little or no property and education, or women of greater age could be included in the electoral rolls once they were deemed to have assumed control over their own voices. Like slaves in ancient times, however, and prisoners in some countries even today, those defined as children still cannot have a say in the laws that govern them, and for the same reasons that had once been used to exclude women or the poor, to say nothing of non-white or colonized populations. I mean, children, of course, are meant to be ineligible for voting and therefore democratic maturity because they are dependent, they are not independent, because they are meant to be not in control, not yet in control of their own voices. But the inclusion of new categories of people into the practices of political representation led to another 19th century anxiety, which had to do with the possibility of a majority drowning out the dissenting voices and interests of minorities, whether defined by birth, wealth, religion, or political views. The prospect of such a tyranny of the majority produced many ideas to have the minority heard, of which John Stuart Mill's proposal in his Considerations on Representative Government is one of the most famous. Mill suggested adding together the votes of constituencies defined not merely by territory but issues, which would allow minorities the chance to represent themselves by their total number. He was, in effect, thinking about minorities as elites and afraid that the expansion of the franchise would drown out the voices of elites. Now, both these liberal anxieties to ensure the independence and meaningfulness of political voice by a process of exclusion and to allow for the representation of minorities amidst the uncertain passions of a more undifferentiated electorate achieved perhaps their starkest manifestation in British India. Voting there was severely restricted by all the qualifications described above from the time it became available to Indians early in the 20th century. And while Mill's efforts to represent minorities made little headway in England, the most fulsome project ever to do so was launched in India. This was a system of joint and separate electorates that guaranteed the election of Hindu and Muslim legislators, as well later as Sikh ones, in areas where each community comprised a minority. The debate over political voice in India was defined not so much by the desire to gain or recover it as to endow it with meaning. For it was typical of British administrators to dismiss Indian demands for a say in their government as being the unrepresentative claims of self-interested elites, the coerced and irresponsible voices of their ignorant followers, or the oppressive desires of a caste or religious majority. Voice in this situation was a mark not of freedom, but slavery and the childish immaturity of those not yet ready to govern themselves. In a reversal of conventional thinking, it was often silence that became the sign of political maturity and power in the empire, with voice understood as the womanly expression of powerlessness. Gandhi's views about voice and silence must be understood in the context of these 19th century debates, whose terms I want to argue he went on to radicalize. The Mahatma's advocacy of silence, in other words, has everything to do with the twin anxieties of voice in the liberal imagination of empire. It had to be meaningful and to stand against the tyranny of the majority. These virtues were nowhere better revealed than in the character of the Englishman as empire builder. In his famous essay, The Intimate Enemy, Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism, Ashish Nandy describes how British ideas of masculinity were formed in imperialism, and I want to dwell upon some of them here. The image of a strong and silent hero laboring to do his duty by those in his care has become a stereotype, one whose imperial context is made clear in locutions like Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden. Important about this figure is the fact that his actions are defined by their silence, not least because they represent a duty that is necessarily unilateral, in that he can have no conversation with those among its objects who are not his equals. The relationship of ruler and ruled in imperialism is silent because it is conceived of as a moral and not a political one, with the former's duty requiring the latter's education but not representation. This is how silence comes to constitute freedom. A good example of such a character is to be found in Thomas Carlyle's book Past and Present, itself a forerunner of Gandhi's criticisms of industrial capitalism with its cult of mammon and utility without moral ideals. In his chapter on the English, Carlyle defines his countrymen's national character by their silence. I quote, "Of all the nations in the world at present, we English are the stupidest in speech, the wisest in action." Close quote. Comparing the English to the Romans in their love of silence, matched as he thought it was by their building of empires, Carlyle pours scorn on the facility of speech as being a sign of powerlessness among the Greeks in ancient times, as the French, of course, Britain's rivals in his own. It comes as no surprise that a colonized population like Indians serve as the exemplars of voluble impotence. I quote, "Nay, of all animals, the freest of utterance I should judge is the genus Simia," i.e. monkeys. "Go into the Indian woods," say all travelers, "and look what a brisk, adroit, unresting ape population it is." Close quote. The awkward silence and even stupidity of the stereotyped Englishman, John Bull, is what Carlyle treasures. Quote, "Nature alone knows thee, acknowledges the bulk and strength of thee. Thy epic unsung in words is written in huge characters on the face of the planet. Sea moles, cotton trades, railways, fleets and cities, Indian empires, Americas, New Hollands, legible throughout the solar system." Close quote. In a chapter titled Democracy, Carlyle goes on to argue that only when the heroic duty of deeds done in silence falters does the politics of institutions take over. Quote, "Hence French revolutions, five-point charters, democracies, and a mournful list of etceteras in these our afflicted times." Close quote. Here then is another criticism of parliamentary democracy for which silence is crucial. While Gandhi was partial to Ruskin and Tolstoy's style of anti-modern radicalism more than to Carlyle's, we shall see how he transformed imperial ideas of silence and freedom, speech and deeds, majority and minority, into a quite novel vision of democracy in which the politics of mastery is replaced by the power of renunciation. Now, like Carlyle, Gandhi wanted to recover the subject's freedom in non-institutional ways, precisely by foregrounding silence in the making of a moral subject. He placed silence alongside fasting, celibacy, and other practices which sought to limit the multiplication of insatiable desires and the ever-growing forms of consumption they promoted. Yet silence had its own role to play in this menu of renunciations, because it addressed not only the body's integrity and moral agency, but specifically that of the mind, or rather its thought and judgment. For Gandhi saw that political speech as it was defined by liberalism only became possible through the mediation of the state and in the shape of an interest. In Hind Swaraj, for example, Gandhi inveighed against doctors and lawyers as, in effect, agents of the colonial state, itself representing the ultimate form of mediation as a neutral third party there to arbitrate between Indians rendered into partisan interests. He described doctors as purveyors of commodities from the pharmaceuticals industry meant to alienate patients from their own bodies in another instance of addiction. Lawyers, for their part, existed not to resolve conflicts, but increase the state's power by imposing a peace that needed constant enforcement between the rival interests it relied upon and therefore had to maintain. Such forms of mediation, of course, represented both the manner in which the colonial state operated as well as its justification, with Gandhi advocating their circumvention in unmediated relations between Indians who should no longer be defined as antagonistic interests to be brought together only by the mediation of the state. The unmediated relations Gandhi sought, however, were not conceived as being either more transparent or authentic, to say nothing of easy and direct. Instead, by removing the medium as a third party, which is the way in which the colonial as also liberal state worked, he wanted to pause communication and force people to think more seriously about its implications. Unmediated relations, in other words, meant juxtaposing persons, parties, and arguments in such a way as to make them conscious of the violence entailed in voice, speech, and language. This is why language played a role in all the instances of mediation I have described, especially the highly technical kind used for legal and medical communication that Gandhi had criticized doctors and lawyers for. But it had also become crucial in certain types of conflict, of which the mounting controversies over proselytism in the 1920s took pride of place, especially among Hindus and Muslims in North India, but also including Christian missionary activity directed against both groups throughout the country. Rather than seeing these disputes as the problematic inheritance of pre-modern identities, we should understand them as the utterly modern products of liberal politics, which had turned religious communities into interests and therefore constituencies. Proselytism, in other words, became controversial for the first time in this manner because it was thought to be an attempt at augmenting the electoral or political power of one group over another, in much the same way as parties operated to diminish the real or potential majority of their rivals. Addressing the violence that accompanied accusations from Hindus, Muslims, and Christians of predatory missionizing by their religious rivals, Gandhi suggested stopping not conversion itself, but its mediation in language. To be true to the ideals of their own faiths, he argued, missionaries should serve as their best representatives in refusing to lie about, unfairly criticize, or run down the religions of others. In doing so, they would also serve humanity by conducting their charitable works in silence and thus drawing converts by the sheer force of their example rather than through unseemly and invariably untruthful polemics. In a 1931 speech to Christian missionaries in London, for example, he said that, quote, "The idea of converting people to one's faith by speech and writings, by appeal to reason and emotion, and by suggesting that the faith of his forefathers is a bad faith, in my opinion, limits the possibilities of serving humanity. Religion is like a rose. It throws out the scent, which attracts like a magnet, and we are drawn to it involuntarily." Close quote. Speech and indeed language itself, in other words, betrayed religious like all other truth by mediating it in argument and collective passion. And while Gandhi was concerned here with missionaries in particular, his criticism held true of persuasion as an important part of political practice more generally. As a fundamental liberal virtue, this kind of argumentation had already become under attack from both the left and the right as a disingenuous form of bourgeois discussion, one incapable of advancing any real change. These ideologues sought to cut liberal debate short by creating facts on the ground, either in acts of empire building, as with Carlyle, or of revolutionary violence, as with Lenin. Gandhi, however, reimagined persuasion in sacrificial terms by offering up the sight and sometimes even spectacle of speechless acts as the most effective demonstration of their truth. In order to manifest itself, therefore, political as much as moral or religious truth had to disavow voice for action and sound for sight in a way that was both linked to and yet quite different from a political thinker like Lenin's theorization of revolutionary action as a force for change. While privileging the visible over the audible as a modality for truth, Gandhi also lent it olfactory form as a fragrance which drew the potential convert to itself involuntarily. In other words, he conceived of neither the visible nor the audible as pure forms, since one could include the sense of smell and another the written word as an amalgam of sight and sound. It was the interpretive and so mediating function of language itself that he distrusted, one for which silence served as an antonym. The unmediated visibility that Gandhi prized as a modality of truth was nothing more than a making visible of silence in persuasion. A metamorphosis or conversion, to use religious terms, in which silence lost its autonomy and was mediated by sight as a negative form. And while this logic seems to countermand Gandhi's emphasis on unmediated relations, it does conform to his propensity for negative forms more generally, of which non-violence, non-possession, and non-cooperation are the most famous. Unlike the kind of mediation that characterized the colonial state, which produced rival interests as positive forms requiring arbitration, silence mediated by sight renounced all positivity and could only be known by its absence as something that was both inaudible and invisible. Silence allowed for unmediated relations because of its doubly negated form. Unlike the ability to speak or reason, which constituted one of the classical definitions of the human species, and indeed of politics, silence did not depend on the logic either of shared capacities or the biological similarities that, in Gandhi's view, served only to fragment humanity into various kinds of hierarchies. Indeed, the imperative to unify the human race through language and reason not only ended by dehumanizing those among its members who were seen as being unreasonable and beyond persuasion, it also drew an absolute separation between one species and another. It was silence or the inability to communicate through language then which made moral relations between humans and animals possible. The context for Gandhi's reflections on interspecies relations was provided in his time by the violent controversies between Hindus and Muslims over cow slaughter. Grappling with these conflicts, Gandhi sought to expand and reinterpret the Hindu injunction to protect cattle not only to human but all animal life. He saw in cow protection humanity's effort to go beyond itself, and in a 1921 article in his journal Young India, emphasized the unilateral and voiceless character of this demand. Quote, "The appeal of the lower order of creation is all the more forcible because it is speechless." Close quote. Without either identifying animal with human life or requiring the kind of contractual reciprocity in their relations that was strangely expected among human beings, Gandhi based them on the very absence of similarity and similitude. As with his views on conversion, which we have seen turn out to be about the problem of liberal persuasion more generally, Gandhi's understanding of cow protection was also about the liberal values of reciprocity and contract. In his view, of course, such values were made possible by the colonial state as a neutral third party, there to mediate between its subjects construed as political interests. But as we have seen, Gandhi thought these relations to be unworkable and deeply violent in the hierarchies they set up. He was fascinated by what moral and so political relations might look like if they were not founded in what he thought was the transient and unequal agreement of a contract. The controversies of cow slaughter allowed Gandhi to imagine relationships unmediated by language in another way. In an article of 1924 in Young India, he came close to attributing language to the cow. Quote, "The cow is the purest type of subhuman life. She pleads before us on behalf of the whole of the subhuman species for justice to it at the hands of man, the first among all that lives. She seems to speak to us through her eyes. You are not appointed over us to kill us and eat our flesh or otherwise ill-treat us, but to be our friend and guardian." Close quote. Yet crucial here is the fact that this appeal is not only voiceless, but unknowable, and thus calls for the unilateral interpretation and moral judgment of human beings. Inevitable in the relations between species, Gandhi thought that relations among human beings too should be marked by an acknowledgement of their fundamental incommunicability and therefore silence. The similarity and difference of this position with Carlyle's should be evident. Now, what does all of this have to do with the link between silence and freedom with which I began this lecture? Let us recall that its 19th century critics had linked the ruination of parliamentary democracy to its abandonment of ideals like truth, justice, and goodness in the power politics of parties. It was the externality of such ideals to the rehearsed speech of party politics that was crucial in limiting the latter's reach. The individual's freedom, in other words, was premised upon these ideals, which alone made political judgment in the public interest possible. They could be instrumentally deployed by parties backed by ascribed social identities, of course, but nevertheless represented ends in their own right, rather than power as a means turned into an end in the form of a limitless desire. Gandhi also sought to reinforce the individual's moral agency in the face of this ruination, and he did so through the prescription of silence over speech. But rather than protecting the subject from outside influence, and so reifying the individual as a purely autonomous being, silence here worked as a form of internal discipline that protected the outside world as well. It was meant additionally to open the individual up to the externality of truth, which in Gandhi's view was another name for God. And this implied that human beings were not brought together by any shared quality like speech and reason, nor a biological one like race or reproduction, but only in their openness to quite alien and metaphysical figures, such as precisely truth, justice, and goodness. To be workable, therefore, democracy required the existence of a subject outside or beyond its own loquacious logic. What became of words and voice in this vision? They were reduced to pure artifice and deprived of any authenticity in the revelation of subject's inner truth. This did not stop communication, just as Gandhi did not cease to read and write during his days of silence, but it did displace and discipline speech as the privileged revelation of inner life. Words and language served as external constraints to test, limit, and shore up the subject, whose truth Gandhi described in his autobiography as being founded on a presupposition. Quote, I have not seen him, neither have I known him. I have made the world's faith in God my own, and as my faith is ineffaceable, I regard that faith as amounting to experience. However, as it may be said that to describe faith as experience is to tamper with truth, it may perhaps be more correct to say that I have no word for characterizing my belief in God. Close quote. It is not that the knowledge or experience of God is so ineffable as to be beyond words, but that it functions wordlessly by virtue of its absence or negative form as a presupposition. God here represents nothing but the silence that for Gandhi destroys the self while opening it up to the externality of its own truth, and on this basis, its relations with others as well. A revelation of emptiness rather than any concealment of being, silence made freedom possible in the very stop it put to the false and often violent mediations of speech, showing that social and even interspecies relations rested on a quite different foundation. And while his ideas might seem arcane, they are no more so than those of Rousseau on the making of the general will as a statistical average. Thank you.
Faisal, are you hearing us now? So Professor Devji has done with his lecture. I think those whosoever having any question, queries related to this or anything on Gandhi should ask their queries. They can write here in the chat box, and I think Faisal would love to respond to it.
Great. So I've received one question which I'll read out and then attempt to answer by Shahana Bhattacharya. Thanks for a fascinating lecture. One question, wouldn't silence as a mode of resistance, as with other negative forms, would only work through its effective redeployment and struggle? So the silence of the generally dispossessed and silent masses by itself be effective? How was this strategy worked? I mean, I guess the thing about silence in the way Gandhi thought of it, or at least in the way in which I described Gandhi's thinking of it, was that it tended to be individual, because he was concerned precisely with the integrity of the individual, and the individual's, if you will, opaqueness from the institutions of power. On the other hand, we know very well that Gandhi was also quite keen to discipline collective resistance through the use of silence. And in fact, one person has written about this, Ranajit Guha, famously in an article called Discipline and Mobilize, in an issue of Subaltern Studies. Now, that title itself, as you can see clearly, is a reference to Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish, on the disciplining and regulation of the modern state. And he's talking about the creation of a carceral society in Europe. And Guha's argument is that by silencing popular protests, Gandhi sought to redirect their power, so that he mediated it, he cut off the forms of popular protest and served as a mediator for it with the colonial state. And for Guha, of course, this is a sign of Gandhi's regressive politics and reactionary politics, because he dismisses popular resistance, which he thinks is defined by cacophony and voice and noise. Now, I think it really is an interesting explanation that Guha gives, but I'm worried about a couple of things. One is that, as in my account, of course, Gandhi is a critic of precisely of mediation. He would not like to place himself as a figure within it. Secondly, Guha does not actually ask what I think of as the more interesting question, which is, how might a Foucauldian idea of discipline and regulation, which requires the state for its sustenance, be propounded by a non-state and indeed an anti-state movement, such as the anti-colonial movement? And if that was possible, then we would have to actually redefine Foucault's ideas. And I think that there is a possibility, and that's a very fascinating possibility. So that's one question which he doesn't address in his critique. And the other, of course, has to do with what Guha sort of sneeringly describes as Gandhi's use of the term mobocracy, which of course Gandhi uses as a description for popular behavior, which for Gandhi is deeply distressing. Now, this of course goes back to Carlyle and others, this idea of the irrational or the tyrannical majority. And strangely, Guha doesn't understand it in this way, that the idea of mobocracy is linked to a prior history in Europe of concerns and anxieties about the tyranny of a large or a collective. So I think, if those two considerations are taken on board, we have the possibility of a much more engaged analysis of silence and resistance. But as I said, my own take on it has been largely individual, because I started off with the figure of the individual as the political actor. And for me, that's important because precisely because Gandhi is critical on the one hand, he calls up collective action, right? And the Indian independence movement, of course, relies upon it. On the other hand, he clearly wants to protect and preserve within it the individual subject. And that subjectivity can be protected, if you will, only by silence. And one place in which you can look at this debate, and it's an open question, is, of course, in Gandhi's famous debate with Tagore on this very subject. When Tagore, in the first non-cooperation movement, criticizes Gandhi precisely for what Gandhi might call mobocracy, right? For mobilizing collective passions, for asking people to all burn foreign cloth, for engaging in acts of what Tagore thought was destruction, and therefore for completely collapsing any possibility for individual autonomy and voice. So I think it really is an open question, and it looks a bit different when you, how should I put it? You can theorize the protection of the individual through the, if you will, philosophy of silence, but when that philosophy is embodied within a collective movement, it takes on a rather different character. And that's where the openness of the question lies, I think. So I have a number of questions. Jyotirmoy Jishnu, I'll read out the question in case some of you can't see. While speaking about Gandhi and politics, he was really very critical on participation of women in political activism. We can see, I think, this very well because he called the women to take part in Indian national movement just to assist their men and return to kitchens after independence was achieved. So isn't it a suppression of the voices of women, indirectly enhancing the power of silent politics? Yes, thank you very much for that. And we know because there has been some extraordinarily important scholarship from the 1980s and 90s, especially feminist scholarship, on Gandhi's views on women and gender in general. And we know, of course, even as late as the Salt March, Gandhi was initially not keen on having women join. But they insisted on joining, and they joined anyway. Whether he wanted them to return to the kitchens is another question, because in 1947, among the women who go on and join Nehru's cabinet are all the women practically who do so come out of Gandhi's ashram. So it's the Gandhian, the specifically Gandhian form of national, if you will, resistance that in fact produces women in public life. Sarojini Naidu already is in public life before she joins Gandhi, but she's shaped by that joining. And of course, you have others such as Hansa Mehta and Sushila Nair, who was Gandhi's doctor, and Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, and there are, of course, many we know. So I wouldn't say that he, in the end, wanted them to return to private life, but what he was very keen on was projecting the, if you will, silent suffering of women, which is a traditional motif and admittedly a reactionary one. What Gandhi wanted to do with this reactionary motif is to actually project it to everyone. So this is something which men are asked to follow. Women are seen as being its archetypal exemplars or representatives. So whether it is the figures of Sita or Savitri famously, or others, it is their silent suffering, which is visible but not audible, that becomes for Gandhi a model of how silence might work in preserving and protecting the subject's own autonomy on the one hand, and on the other, providing an example to others. So yes, women are important. And it is certainly problematic what Gandhi picks up from these images and cliches and stereotypes about women. Yet he does so to universalize them. He doesn't do so in order to say only women should be like this and men shouldn't. So in some ways, he does the reverse of what the 19th and early 20th century reformers of women in India did, Hindus, Muslims, and others, where their task was to, as it were, make women more like men, right? By endowing them with previously masculine freedoms and masculine attitudes, and having these attitudes and freedoms be defined as being generic. What Gandhi does is he wants to, if you will, feminize men. And I use these terms only for cliches and stereotypes, of course, that a moral character which is seen as being, or was seen as being peculiar to women, is now to be expanded to men in a non-generic fashion. Again, these practices and these recommendations do not have a univocal morality to them. You can see them, you can see their nuances and ambiguities, but that would be my response in any case. I have a question by Riddhi Parmar. Are there any prerequisites in a heterogeneous society to be able to effectively employ silence as a method of societal reform / revolution? That's interesting. I suppose the context I was speaking of was, and the context which Gandhi actually invokes, is one, as he tells us as early as his Swaraj, of parliamentary democracy. So it is a context in which voice has become politically paramount in its collective form. And it is not to how should I put it, to denigrate democracy, obviously, that either he or Ruskin or Tolstoy or others will question the role of this voice in it, but rather so as to prevent the idea of voice in parliamentary democracy from completely overrunning its own presumed subject. And this was why I mentioned in the very first paragraph of my talk the figure of the secret ballot, right? The paradox of the fact that a form of government and a form of politics which seems to be entirely reliant upon voice has at its very heart silence. A form of politics and governance that has that is described by collectives, large collectives and majorities, that counts up people in order to produce majorities, has at its center the individual disconnected from large numbers, and the individual who is silent and who is making his or her decision in silence in order to protect. And it's order. In other words, Gandhi's views on silence are meant not to set aside either voice or democracy, because he understands these as being crucial, of course. He's very critical of parliaments in Hind Swaraj, but he ends up, as we know, promoting parliament when it comes to the independence of India eventually. What he's worried about is the possibility of parliamentary democracy destroying its own presumptive subject. And once that happens, then no freedom is possible. Then only the forms of democracy are possible. So how do you have it? How do you have collective decision-making, parliaments and parties and all the rest, without, while preventing its self-destructive potential? So Gandhi, I think, wants to do so by limiting its reach, and he does so in very many ways. Just to look at the national movement, we know that by 1947, when the Indian nation-state is about to come into its own, Gandhi actually draws a very clear line. I just described how a number of the women who joined Nehru's cabinet come from his ashram, but Gandhi also tells his ashram members, either you join political life, institutional political life, and that's fine, or you remain in the ashram and you do constructive work in society. And those two things are not to overlap. If you're Nehru and you're prime minister, it's a good thing you be prime minister. But if you're Vinoba or you're someone else and you're in the ashram, your work is meant to actually set a limit to the work of your own colleague, Nehru in this case. Because what you want to do is to make sure that social life is not overrun entirely by the logic of political parties. That social life actually is an arena for moral and political action that is autonomous. So it's not an either or scenario. It's a question of limiting, of mutual limitations. But if you look at someone like the political philosopher Simone Weil, who in many ways is quite close to Gandhi, though I don't think a comparison has been made between the two. She too is interested in sacrifice and fasting and all. In fact, she dies in a kind of act of fasting. She wants to abolish all political parties. So she starts off with the same premise as Gandhi, that they end up overrunning their own presumptive subject. And what she thinks should happen is the abolition. She writes an essay, famous essay called On the Abolition of All Political Parties. And she thinks politics should be reconstituted along other lines. Whereas for Gandhi, he of course asks the Congress Party to dissolve itself in 1947 so that new parties can arise, in view of the different conditions in India. And that the Congress Party was there only to win freedom in his view, and it should cease to exist. That clearly didn't happen, but he doesn't want to disband political parties altogether. So here is a question by Ajit Kumar. I just want to know why Gandhi maintained complete silence on the questions posed to him by his supporters/leaders after his unilateral decision of suspension of the non-cooperation movement. But Gandhi broke his silence in the middle of the great trial, I suppose, he faced, where he invites the judge and asks him to resign as judge since he was not presiding over a just system. That's very good. I like that. I think the silence, he wasn't entirely silent, of course, because non-cooperation was suspended due to the Chauri Chaura violence, and he says as much. And there are other suspensions at other points of his career, and the suspensions invariably that are brought about due to acts of violence. And in a way, the suspension is itself a form of silence, I should say. He explains it, and in this sense, I should make the equation in the other direction. Rather than seeing suspension as a form of silence, you'd see silence as a form of suspension. Something I said in my lecture, that what silence is meant to do is actually put a stop to things, to slow things down. And that's what Gandhi does repeatedly in his career, much to the annoyance of people like Nehru, who think one should push on, and secure victory while the going was good. And Gandhi, of course, was not happy with this, because he refused to compromise the virtue of means, which he thought was crucial, and he refused to sacrifice means to ends. As we know, this is his interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita, in particular, of Nishkam Karma, of how you must act without any attention to the fruits of your action, or to your desires for those fruits. So the fact of pausing, of suspending, is a kind of, if you will, a form of practice that is equivalent to silence. And it is the form, I might argue, that silence takes in political action. Now, in the trial for sedition, what's interesting there, to my mind, is that when he speaks to the judge, as of course he must, he speaks in a language that is not his own, and that is what he makes clear. I mean, what he tells the judge is, I don't believe in this form of justice in the court, in the justice you represent, or in the courts. For me, this is not legitimate. Nevertheless, since you will not understand, if you will, my voice, let me speak to you in your own language. I will explain what I have done in your language, though I do not hold it to be legitimate. And I will tell you in your language why it is that you are the guilty party and not me. So what that trial is very interestingly does is it allows Gandhi to speak not in his own voice, in that sense he's silent, but to speak in the received voice of the court. Right? And to plead guilty, remember he does plead guilty, even though he doesn't believe he is. So it's a form that he uses over and over again to say, I will accede to you, I will agree with you, not because I actually believe in it, but because this is the only language you understand. And I will show you in your own language how it is that you are contradicting yourself. So there's a kind of second and third order set of, if you will, language games going on here, in which Gandhi is rehearsing and performing a script and showing its contradictions almost in a Socratic manner, while yet remaining in some ways outside the whole theater, right? And it is a piece of theater, as we know. Vinayak Nair has a question. How, according to your opinion, have the methods of silence and nonviolence employed by Mahatma Gandhi in the Indian national movement helped and influenced other Asian and African countries to liberate themselves from European control, particularly from the British Empire? I haven't actually thought about that. And I don't know of, I'm not well informed enough of these other movements to be able to speak with any certainty about them, except to say that even though it might have been inadvertent, when you look at the end of apartheid in South Africa, in which, of course, Gandhi was a serious figure to conjure with among the activists of the African National Congress, it was the very imposed silence of the silence imposed upon figures like Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for many years on Robben Island, and others, that actually had this incredible effect. Now, whether Mandela whether it was a silence that was voluntarily adopted or not is another question. In fact, it's an irrelevance; it doesn't arise. But in fact, it was the silence that had an enormous effect. And it had an effect very unlike that, which might have been possible if there was a kind of, as in India, where political voice was possible within political parties throughout or for much of colonial rule, apart from, you know, these points of where speech was seen as being so dangerous that rules of sedition were brought to bear. So I think in that way, if in no other, silence has worked. But otherwise, I think it's been, and even with Mandela, you can see, conceived of in highly individualistic ways. And so that goes back to the first question of how this form of individual protection, the protection of the individual subject and individual discipline, translates into collective action. I have a question by Amit Suman. I have two small queries. One, the depiction of the formative influence of South Africa on Gandhi's politics and ethics, and two, the differences between Gandhi and Ambedkar on caste, Dalits, and the nation. Focusing on these two themes, race and caste, allows us to see how works like Guhas are central to the reproduction of Gandhi as Mahatma, but obscure our understanding of Gandhi, the man. Yeah, well, I've just said something about South Africa. On Ambedkar, so see, here, of course, along with the question of women that came earlier, is where you see the very problematic seams, if you will, of Gandhi's argumentation. What does it mean to counsel silence for lower caste or Dalit movements? Movements and groups of people who have endured enforced silence for a long time, historically. Is a politics of silence of the kind Gandhi describes conceivable or conceived simply on the model of upper caste, as it were, in quotes, free or dominant male figures? I think there is something to it, to counsel silence to people who are already silent. It represents something of a paradox. But that on the one hand. On the other hand, I suppose, and this is why Ambedkar is so fulsome in his demands for voice. I suppose what I would say is for Gandhi is concerned not with voice and silence simply as, if you will, physiological or institutional forms, but precisely with what can be heard as voice or acknowledged or understood as voice. So as I was saying in my lecture, in the form of parliamentary democracy, voice only represents itself as interest. And once it does, it presumes a structure of authority in which the state, the liberal state, which is also the colonial state, is a neutral third party that is there to arbitrate between interest groups. Now, Gandhi militates against this in many ways. First, because he thinks that interest is a category that comes out of capitalism, because you can only have an interest in something, even if it is your own identity, that is understood in terms of your property. Now, remember when I was describing the qualifications for voting in earlier times, often it was property that was the chief qualification. And it was the chief qualification because interests were linked to property, that only if you had property could you have an interest in protecting it. If you had none, you were, if you will, a radical free agent, a loose cannon, and you could not be relied upon. Your voice could not be heard precisely because you had no investment. You could just say random things. So in all these words, investment, property, interest, they all circle around the emergence of capitalism. And for Gandhi, this was problematic not only on its own terms, but also because he thought in India, property, given the large-scale poverty of India and the fact that most people in India had no property at all, that property could not define social relations in India. So it could not serve as a hegemonic form. And therefore, interests could not emerge in the same fashion as they did perhaps in England. Though he thought even in England, they could not hegemonize all of social relations. And if they did, it would be an absolute travesty and an absolute misery, because then all human relations would be purely contractual, and you could not have relations of love or sacrifice between parents and children or between lovers or whatever, right? That for Gandhi, of course, sacrifice is the absolutely crucial moral modality, and interest prevents that from happening altogether. Interest destroys all human relations. It cannot put them together. So this is a long-winded way to say that for Gandhi, interest was both seriously problematic in its own right as a form of capitalism, but on top of that, it was unavailable for the most part in India. It was only available in places. And indeed, Ambedkar agrees. In fact, Ambedkar theorizes this far better than Gandhi does, when he argues that interest has been in his polemical terms, interest has been captured by Brahmins for themselves, and no one else is allowed to have it. And most people are not allowed to have property of any kind, and therefore, interest cannot be generalized in Indian society. What Ambedkar wants to do, unlike Gandhi, is to institute interest precisely. And he does so eventually by writing in property for Dalits in the constitution through reservations. Right? So that allows for this group of people to finally gain the status of interest. And what Ambedkar doesn't like about Gandhi is that he calls up all these passions, which Ambedkar himself describes as being either above reason or below it, right? So he thinks that the movements led by Gandhi can either be ethereal, that people are noble in their sacrifices, that they're above interest, right? And disinterested in that sense, or they can be absolutely brutal, below reason and below interest in that sense. And he doesn't like that possibility, this alternative. He would rather have everything be nicely wrapped up as interest. So I'm sorry I've had to go on a tangent, but I hope you see how it fits into my argument, which is the paper I gave you today is part of a larger investigation precisely into categories such as interest, voice, etc. So that is my somewhat disjointed answer to that question. I don't know how much time we have for questions. I have a number more here. Amit, you'll let me know. Rajbans has a question. In the light of the statement you have given regarding the biblical reverence of newspapers in the English societies and to form the various so-called truths, could it be true to conclude that the truth is subject to various perceptions, mentality, and ideological tendencies of individuals, and of course, the source of information? Could we ever come to a universal aspect of truth satisfied by all, or have we lost our ways in dealing with illusionary truths all over us? Yes, I mean, Gandhi, of course, was Satya, truth, is at the very heart of his politics and his morality. To the degree that political resistance is called satyagraha, as we know, it's defined by truth. But for Gandhi, truth is never known. That the quote that I read from him about God, that God is a presupposition, and God is truth, right? So truth must be your presupposition, but you can never claim full control over it or knowledge of it. Indeed, if that were the case, there would be no movement at all. It'd just be stasis. And truth only becomes, insofar as it's knowable, it only becomes possible through diversity of various kinds, right? So that is his argument about religious pluralism, that since no religious group has full control over the truth, they are there to learn from each other. I don't mean by learning from each other that, you pick and choose like in a shop, some bit of truth that you don't have, but rather that the neighbor, whether it's a religious neighbor or any other kind of neighbor, is there to keep you true to yourself, to your own definition of what truth is. And in doing so, it allows you to test your own definition of truth. And you also learn from the neighbor to see how they remain true to themselves, etc. So the multiplicity of possible truths is for Gandhi a good thing, because it really forces you to test your idea of truth. But in any case, this truth must be a presupposition, and it must always be a journey. The problem is when people do claim absolute knowledge of truth. Now, the thing about silence is that for Gandhi, it's important precisely because you cannot rely upon communication, and you cannot know even the inner truth of the person with whom you're communicating, even if they are very voluble about it. So the thing about silence is that it presumes action without full knowledge. So this is another way in which is concerned with the issue of truth, right? Truth in the form of knowledge, let's say. How do you act in such a circumstance if it's not available to you? And how do you act morally in this circumstance? This goes back to the question about the different newspapers who say different things. You can condemn them by saying they are self-interested and they're acting in the interests of their political parties, but that doesn't really get you very far because you're not sure about your own interests either. So you must be able to act in such a way as not to rely upon these various versions of truth, while yet learning from them in the sense that they should force you to think about your own definition of what truth is and to keep you true to yourself. But for Gandhi, the important point is how do you act morally without knowledge, without communication, and therefore without knowledge? And that's where you recall the example I gave about interspecies relations, which for Gandhi were the model for all relations. We normally think about interspecies relations by anthropomorphism, right? We treat animals as if they were human beings, so we absorb them into the human milieu and pretend to endow them with voice. We humanize them in the same way as I was describing the way in which reformers of women in the 19th century absorbed women or sought to absorb women partly or in whole into a masculine, previously defined masculine world. What Gandhi is saying rather is that if you take as your model of communication and of moral action the relationship between human beings and non-human life, you must exclude voice and communication from it, as also all forms of anthropomorphism, biological relations and similarities, right? So you clearly, there's no voice or communication. There is no, as it were, commensality in the direct sense. There is certainly no sexual or reproductive relations with animals, etc., etc. So all the things that define human beings, that are meant to define human beings biologically, do not apply in this relationship. Nevertheless, this relationship is, for that very reason, the most moral one possible. It is unilateral because the animal cannot speak to you. But it needn't be unilateral in a kind of patronizing or paternalistic or imperious way. So it's a way of thinking about the gift and about unilaterality in a non-Carlyle type way. Right? For Carlyle, there was no voice possible because there was no equality, and so the empire was a gift to its subjects, for which the gift giver was endlessly glorified. For Gandhi, he takes the logic of the unilateral and tries to do something else with it, and tries to see it as a form of renunciation, and the making of a moral life that did not depend upon all of these things. Similarly, he says even about his own wife, Kasturba, whom you would think he knew very well, said, I actually don't know what she really thinks. So there's always a kind of a stoppage or a gap or a suspension, to go back to the idea of the suspension, that for Gandhi is crucial, because he believes that one shouldn't be so easily waylaid by this idea that we know what's happening and we communicate very easily and we understand everything. So it's silence is a way of thinking about that stoppage or that blockage or that suspension, and having recognized it, of making moral relations possible despite it. So there's a question by Surbhi Dwivedi, but I think I've responded to that when I spoke about Ambedkar and what does it mean to think about imposing silence or asking groups of people who have been silenced, in fact, to take silence as their ideal, when what they desire is the ability to speak. I entirely take that point. I have a question on the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yes, I wrote about this in my book on Gandhi. He does fall silent with the nuclear bomb. And one reason why, Gandhi is grappling with it. It's silence of a different kind, because he sees that with the emergence of nuclear power, the form of visible protest that he had recommended, silent but visible, that was no longer possible. So, Gandhi writes and says, well, how might it have been possible for the Japanese to resist nonviolently when the bomb was coming from a height so great that the pilot would not even see them? Because the point of voiceless resistance, of visible but inaudible resistance, is that it was meant to convert the enemy, right? What you were meant to do was to convince the enemy that you were correct, and to do so through an act of love. And so Gandhi thought that language actually did not permit this. That is only by actually excising language and by what he called self-suffering, by renunciation or by sacrifice, that you could actually convert the enemy. And agreement, therefore, would become possible without language, because language was a false mediator. Now, how was that possible with atomic weaponry? Eventually, Gandhi suggests that whether or not the visibility is there, the emergence of the atomic bomb only proved that violence was not successful in resolving anything. That you could only dial it up more and more and more and more, and either end up with a global tyranny where a nuclear power ran everyone else out of fear, or what came to be called mutually assured destruction, where different nuclear powers just destroyed each other. So for him, the loss of visibility in resistance was, if you will, compensated for by the fact that he thought that the emergence of atomic weaponry simply proved his point about the necessity of nonviolence. That now, with the possibility of destroying the whole of humankind and indeed the destruction of life on Earth, it became absolutely clear that the only recourse we had globally was nonviolence, that violence was not a recourse any longer. He also thought, he played with this idea of, if in these air raids with nuclear weapons, if the Japanese or others had simply not gone into bunkers and carried on without a care in the world, that might have affected the bombers in some way, because they would have known that this is not a city that was locked down. So it was a kind of vulnerability as an invitation to conversion, if you will. Let's see. I have. Yes, so Amit has said that I think I have. Shall I take one or two more? Is that all right? Or I don't know. I don't want to keep you very long. So there's a question again about inequality and caste, which I think I've addressed. I would also in view of the last question, also to show that the deprivation of voice, of course, does not imply the deprivation of resistance, so that even without voice, you have the visibility, your resistance has to be visible. So what Gandhi, for instance, advises Jews in Germany during the Second World War, he says, if you cannot fight, and how could they fight the Nazis? And if you cannot flee, then what you must do is resist in another way. And it's a difficult piece of advice that he gave them, that at the very least, do not allow yourselves to be dragged out in the middle of the night to be taken to a prison. He didn't know, of course, about the concentration camps that we eventually came to know about. That you must do so, you must resist openly but non-violently. Why must you do that? You must do that in order to show everyone, first of all, to show all your neighbors that this is happening. They cannot claim later on that they didn't know it was happening. The police come in the middle of the night and take you away. Secondly, it is in order to show to the very Germans who are coming to take you prisoner that it is you, the Jews, who actually embody the virtues that the Germans think they represent, of bravery, of courage, of sacrifice, all of these things, because these are virtues wherever you go. And so what he advises the Jews to do is, by their silent protests, non-violent resistance, even if they are being dragged to their deaths, to display that they are the holders of those virtues. And that might shake the German soldiers who have been sent to bring them in. And if it doesn't shake them, it will certainly allow their descendants in the future to claim these Jews as the truest of Germans. And it will at the same time allow the descendants of these Jews themselves to feel proud of their ancestors and not to be humiliated by their annihilation. So these are difficult pieces of advice to give anyone, certainly to give Jews on the verge of extinction. And I would add only that Gandhi thought that if a fight were possible, he was certainly not against it. Right? And he was always like this. If you cannot resist non-violently, you must act violently to prevent either your own or someone else's killing. Right? So these are all ways in which he argued that even people who could have no voice, as Jews in Germany did not, they had no institutional voice, they had been deprived of their citizenship, could nevertheless make visible their resistance in a fashion that allowed either for their own salvation in the present, or for the salvation of their descendants and the descendants of their enemies in the future. In any case, nonviolent resistance was meant to convert the enemy. I would like to offer that as an example of the way in which even otherwise voiceless populations could, in Gandhi's view, embark upon nonviolence. And I might add that Ambedkar himself continued to use the term, the arch-Gandhian term satyagraha. That is Gandhi's term. And while he was understandably and very often correctly critical of Gandhi, Ambedkar never forsook that word. And I think it shows you he understands where it's coming from, but he continues using it. Now, let's see. There are more and more questions. And I think, shall I stop there? I think because otherwise it'll just go on infinitely. Thank you very much. I'm sorry wasn't able to hear you, but so you had to put up with my voice, and and you have really been Gandhian in being voiceless on this in this particular event.
I guess for rest of the audience and professors, Akanksha, you can speak up.
Good evening, everyone. Is all good things come to an end in life? So is today's webinar. So on behalf of the Department of History KMC in collaboration with Internal Quality Assurance Cell IQAC, I take this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks to those who have directly and indirectly contributed to this webinar on Gandhi's speechless politics organized by our department. At the outset, I extend a heartfelt gratitude to our guest speaker, Professor Faisal Devji. We are really enlightened with your knowledge and presence. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out time from your busy schedule. I would also like to thank uh, I would also like to thank our principal, Professor Vibha Singh Chauhan, ma'am, for her enthusiastic support. A special thanks to the organizing and teaching staff for their unflinching support and coordination. Last but not the least, our heartfelt thanks to the students for their active participation in the webinar. With these words and kind messages, we move towards the end of today's webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and hence we officially end today's lecture.